A recurring question for a lot of us is something like, what's the source of sin? Who's ultimately responsible? Is it God? Is it us? Is it one guy named Adam? Is it demons? Who's at fault here? Who's to blame? My my notion, my idea here is this. At the end of the day, that question only matters in terms of theodicy and apologetics. Um, it does have implications. Your answer to the question will have implications for your systematic theology as a whole. That's true. But you're going to have a hard time you're going to have a hard time coming up with a way in which, at the end of the day, at the very beginning, God is not somehow responsible. If you believe that God creates, and you believe that God either doesn't know what's coming but leaves it open, or does know what's coming and sees what's coming down the pike and creates anyway, no matter what you do, if you believe that God is the creator, then at the long end of causal events, you have to put let God take responsibility for this world being the way it is. Doesn't mean we don't have our culpability. We do. We all know that. We can look down and be like, yep, I probably shouldn't have done that thing that I did. But that we have a universe like this that is composed of the things that it's composed of, I just don't see how you're going to avoid, in some macro ultimate way, putting the responsibility or the source of this at God's feet. Now, I agree that Augustine will tell you that that sin is just a negation; it's just an absence of the good. But the fact of the matter is, God created a universe where it's possible to have an absence of the good. He did. And it seems, if we reflect on it, that God could have done otherwise. Now, maybe you want to go down that road and you want to argue that. But here's all that said, yes, I think that ultimately you're going to have to lay the responsibility for everything at God's feet. Maybe you don't. But either way, that is it's an abstract question. It's important to have a really coherent and compelling and winning an affable response to that question. But the reason you need that is because you need it for something like apologetics and evangelism, or you need it for theodicy. You need it for people who are asking questions either because they think the faith is crazy or because they want to make sense of their faith in light of their experience. And those are practical questions. So it's good to have deep, precise, rigorous thinking about these things from a theological, philosophical level. But it's also good to remember to never forget that these things need to be able to be understood and reckoned by actual people who are questioning their faith or who are, attacking your faith. And that's ultimately the value of those types of questions. Now, once you've gotten past that, once you've gotten past all of the theory and you're comfortable with where you think sin comes from, and you're comfortable with the kind of answers that you're going to give people, you're comfortable with how you're able to reckon God's goodness with the existence of evil and suffering and sin, and once you've come to all of those, you've settled for yourself, at least you're able to wake up in the morning and feel good about where you're at with those things. Once you've done that, then stop asking the question. Instead of asking who's responsible, ask what do we do now? If this is just like the most practical thing that we as ministers and as theologians can do, is once we've satisfied whatever intellectual curiosity we have about where sin comes from, the next thing that we need to think about is how does God deal with it and how do we participate in that? And that is why I think it's important to talk about demons, and it's important to talk about social sin. It's important to talk about individual sin. Not because I want us to have like a really complicated explanation or etiology for where sin comes from, but so that we can really think critically about how the cross addresses it, which is really one of the big themes this week in atonement, is how the cross addresses it and how we as new creation participate in the cleaning up of the sin problem in the world, in ourselves, in our communities, and as the result of invisible demonic influence. That's where we have to get to. One of the dangers of theology, one of the temptations of theology, is to spend so much time in the world of theory and the world of questioning, and that we never get to kind of the place that the scriptures assume we always should be at, which is, let's deal with it. How much of the New Testament? Think of a great example is the book of Ephesians. You divide it up into two sections, 3 books each, right? The first 3 books, this is the situation. You're a new creation. This is God's mysterious unfolding of God's plan throughout the ages to create the redemption and the incarnation of Christ, the redemption and the forgiveness of sins, the ransom from captivity, and this is, you created the church, and you have this glorious inheritance. That's all this theology. It's the first 3 chapters. Very important stuff. Why? So that I, the prisoner of the Lord, call you to walk worthy of the calling with which you are called. Live this way. This is, now that all this has been done by God, this is what our lives look like as a result. And Ephesians is great because it integrates social sin, individual sin, and demonic the powers and the influences of the powers, and says that's all going on. You're in a hostile environment. You're living out what it is to be the church. This is how you have to be faithful in light of all that. No, this is what it looks like. Here it is, church in Ephesus. This is what it's going to be like. If we get too caught up in trying to make sense of who's responsible for what was this one the result of a demon? Was this one the result of a social system? Was this one just because I was weak and the flesh is weak? And then even getting more meta and is God responsible for all of this? And if so, how is God good? The problem with getting caught up in all that is that we lose our ability to muster up the energy and the will to do what the scriptures call us to, which is to change, to fix things, to pursue holiness, sanctification, however you want to describe it. So we use the terminology, we create the labels of the demonic and the social and the individual to help recognize that the kind of work we're going to be doing as purveyors of, those who proclaim the message of the reconciliation of God, because we're called to that, we need to recognize the various domains into which we're going to have to deploy that message, that charisma, and the different kinds of tactics and strategies we're going to have to use depending on what we're dealing with. Social sin is not going to be dealt with in the same way as individual sin, and demonic influence and demonic power is not going to be rejected and expelled in the same way that social sin or individual sin is. And that's why it's important to have those categories, not to answer some deep theological, philosophical questions, although it helps, but to help us know where do we go from here. So, I like to get lost in the clouds as much as the next person. In fact, quite a bit more than the next person, as it turns out. But as a pastor, I recognize that that's not the only place I have to be.